Hello, my dear dreamers. Tonight, we journey not just through history, but through the hushed winds of memory, across the silent grasslands of ancient Central Asia, where destiny stirred beneath a sky wider than imagination. Envision endless steppes stretching beyond the eye's reach, where tall grasses sway like ocean waves, and the scent of wild thyme mingles with cool air that whispers forgotten tales. This was not merely a land, it was a breathing world beneath the stars, where one of the most legendary stories of human civilization began with the birth of a boy named Temujin. So close your eyes, let your breathing settle like soft wind on a quiet plain, and walk with me, not just through centuries and empires, but into the heart of a child who would one day reshape the world. Picture your feet in the dew-kissed grass, the soil cool beneath you, the sun gently dipping into a golden horizon. All around, fires glow in small clusters as clans gather under the cloak of dusk, and an empire waits to be born, not in the clash of swords, but in the quiet choices of survival, leadership, and unity. Tonight, we will witness not battles, but transformation. The silent power of vision, of patience, of resilience. And when the stars rise over the steppe, remember, even the greatest empires shine brightest just before they dissolve into the velvet shadows of memory. Let us begin. It was the year 1162, a time when maps were blank parchment and the world felt infinite. In the heart of the Mongolian steppe, in a land kissed by golden dawn and bitter wind, a child opened his eyes to a world both wild and wondrous. His name was Temujin. His cries mingled with the rustle of grasses and the far-off call of larks riding the breeze. His arrival was humble, his future unimaginable. This was a place where heaven met earth at every horizon. The seasons swept across the landscape like tides over a living sea of grass. Here, life was raw and real, defined by wind, water, and the will to endure. Temujin's father, Yasuge, was a lesser chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a proud but modest leader among dozens of semi-nomadic tribes, each roaming the plains like stars scattered across the heavens. The Mongols of this time followed their herds, horses, sheep, cattle, with instinct and tradition, moving with the rhythm of the land. Their homes were felt yurts, dome-shaped and warm, appearing and disappearing across the landscape like mushrooms after rain. In the hush of night, these yurts glowed softly, filled with stories and song. It was within one of these shelters that Temujin took his first steps, his tiny feet walking upon earth that would one day tremble beneath his army's thunder. As a child, Temujin learned to ride a pony before he could even properly speak. For the Mongol children, horse and rider were one, fluid, inseparable. The sound of hooves became the rhythm of childhood. By the age of 5, he could gallop bareback, his face split with a fearless smile as wind tugged at his hair. Evenings were sacred. When shadows lengthened and the sky burned with firelight and fading blue, families gathered. Around each fire, elders spoke of past battles and ancestral spirits, of sacred wolves and whispered omens. The stories wove warmth into the night. Under these stars, Temujin listened, wide-eyed, learning not just history, but identity. Yet for all its beauty, the steppe was merciless. When Temujin was just 9, tragedy struck. His father, poisoned by rival Tatars, age-old enemies whose grudges ran deep, left the boy and his family alone, vulnerable. The protection of his father's followers evaporated like mist at dawn. Allies scattered like dry leaves before the wind, leaving Temujin's mother, Hoelun, to raise her children alone in a world that respected only strength. Their survival became a daily trial. Gone were the warm meals and furs of a chieftain's camp. Now they survived on wild roots, river fish, and small game. Temujin, once a boy of laughter, learned to trap birds and dig edible bulbs from the cold earth. His hands grew calloused, his eyes more watchful. His mother remained a pillar, her voice calm, her teachings firm. She sang to them even in hardship, her lullabies as strong as armor. Picture young Temujin standing on a small rise, wind pulling at his ragged clothes. His boots are worn thin, but he stands tall, eyes fixed on the distant mountains. Perhaps even then, the fire had begun to burn. A dream, faint but persistent, that the scattered tribes might one day unite under a single banner. As he grew, he began to draw others to him, not by force, but by presence. Something in the way he carried himself, a quiet, resolute energy, spoke to the outcasts and wanderers. By his teenage years, he had formed bonds with others like him, young men with no inheritance, but much potential. Among them was Jamuka, his blood brother, his equal, and eventually his rival. Together, they rode the open plains, learned the art of survival, and studied the unspoken codes of loyalty and politics. Temujin learned to read the land like scripture. The way grass leaned revealed days of wind. The sky's smell foretold rain. A horse's breath could tell him of illness or health. He tracked herds with a hunter's intuition and found hidden water where the earth seemed dry. But the most enduring lesson came from betrayal. When a half-brother stole a fish he had caught, Temujin made a choice that shocked even his own family. In that moment, he showed a cold resolve, a willingness to protect what was his at any cost. It was a decision born not from cruelty, but from necessity. The step, after all, forgives neither sentiment nor hesitation. As seasons turned and Temujin entered manhood, his name began to echo across the lands. Around fires, whispers told of a boy with no wealth or name, who inspired loyalty stronger than blood. Some feared him, others admired. All watched. At night, Temujin would lie outside their modest yurt and stare at the stars. The Milky Way spanned above like a river of dreams. Perhaps he traced its path with his eyes, wondering what waited beyond the horizon. Was there more? Could these warring tribes become something greater? In the hush of the night, with only snorting horses and distant owls breaking the silence, the foundation of an empire began to take shape, not with weapons but with vision. He had lost everything. And because of that, he was willing to build something no one could ever take away again. He dreamed, and the stars seemed to whisper back. As the final decades of the 12th century drifted toward their close, the Mongol steppe lay sprawled like a magnificent yet broken mosaic. Each tribe, like a shard of painted glass, gleamed with its own pride and customs, yet the pieces had never formed a unified picture. For generations, rival clans had circled one another in an endless dance of alliance and betrayal, blood feud and fragile truce. It was into this chaotic web of honor, vengeance, and nomadic independence that Temujin rode, not as a conqueror at first, but as a quiet weaver, thread by thread, binding a vision of unity across the wind-scoured lands. Picture him not on a battlefield, but by a humble campfire. A man in his mid-20s, his cloak worn from years of hardship, his voice low and deliberate. Around him sit the chieftains of small bands, men hardened by decades of wandering and warfare. They listen not to a king, but to someone who speaks their language of survival and silence. He does not promise gold or comfort. He offers something rarer, purpose, a chance to end the cycle of blood. a vision of a world where scattered clans ride under one standard, not out of fear, but out of shared future. These early conversations formed the roots of revolution. Beneath a canopy of stars so ancient they had watched over his childhood, Temujin sowed alliances, not with swords, but with sincerity. He knew trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned in long hours of talk, of shared meals, of moments where men saw one another as equals. The flicker of flames danced across weathered faces, shadows of future greatness born in quiet words and patient nods. His first significant ally was Togrul, Khan of the Kerites, a powerful figure and former friend of Temujin's late father. The relationship was delicate, fragile as spider silk stretched across a tree branch, yet it held. Togrul saw something rare in the young warrior, a clarity of purpose and a strength rooted not in cruelty, but in conviction. Through Togrul's influence, Temujin gained more than an ally. He gained legitimacy among those who respected tradition. Yet not all paths to unity were smooth. Among the allies who had once shared boyhood dreams, Jamuka, Temujin's Anda, his sworn blood brother, began to take a different path. While Temujin reached out to the disenfranchised, welcoming warriors from broken lines and outcast families, Jamuka clung to the rigid hierarchies of the old ways. To him, honor was birthright. To Temujin, it was earned. The contrast between them was poetic. Jamuka, the noble of tradition. Temujin, the reformer of vision. One clung to bloodlines like sacred scrolls. The other believed unity could bloom from merit. Their paths, once parallel, diverged like rivers seeking separate seas. Temujin's growing band was unlike anything the steppe had seen. Not just warriors, though they were many, but herders, smiths, artisans, widows, and orphans. All were welcomed if they pledged loyalty. This wasn't just an army, it was a movement, one that whispered a promise into the wind: you belong. A pivotal moment came at Baljuna, a remote and muddy spring far from the eyes of kings or scribes. Fewer than 20 stood with him that day, yet what they did would echo for centuries. They drank from the same water, muddy though it was, and swore oaths not of conquest, but of eternal brotherhood. No gold changed hands, no crown was offered, only loyalty, forged in hunger and hope. From these beginnings, the slow miracle of unification unfolded, not as a surge, but as a rising tide. Temujin's approach was methodical. He studied grievances like a scholar with ancient texts. He learned the tangled threads that connected families, remembered who had feuded over pasture land decades ago, who had betrayed whom and why. He used this knowledge not to exploit, but to reconcile. Where others saw enemies, he saw equations. What would it take to bring this tribe in? What would heal this wound? Some clans came willingly, drawn by his fairness. Others resisted. When diplomacy failed, Temujin did not shy from battle. But even here, he remained strategic. He punished only when necessary, sparing lives when possible, always seeking to avoid waste. War was a tool, not a hunger. One such campaign was against the Merkits, a tribe that had once kidnapped Temujin's wife Berta. The assault was swift, precise, and just. He not only rescued his beloved, but showed the other tribes what loyalty and retaliation meant under his command. It wasn't just a rescue. It was a message. Hurt what is mine, and justice will come, not in rage, but in order. And when other tribes saw how the defeated were treated, respected, integrated, valued, they began to reconsider their resistance. Why fight a man who gave honor even to the vanquished? But power never rises unopposed. Jamuka, now wary of his former friend's meteoric ascent, rallied a coalition of traditionalist nobles. They feared Temujin, not just for his charisma, but for what he represented, the end of their inherited privilege. His inclusive vision was radical, and to them, dangerous. The Battle of Dalambaljut brought this simmering tension to a boil. It was not just a clash of warriors, but of worlds. Jamukha's forces were larger, wealthier, nobler by blood. Temujin's were leaner, hungrier, held together by chosen loyalty rather than ancestral claim. Under storm-dark skies, their two armies met. Temujin suffered a tactical defeat, but something deeper shifted. Jamukha, in victory, ordered the brutal execution of prisoners, and in that moment, many of his followers looked away in discomfort. They saw not strength, but fear, and they remembered Temujin's mercy. In the seasons that followed, men began to drift toward the rising star. Warriors came not alone, but with families. Chiefs sent sons to serve under Temujin's banner. His campfires multiplied. His ideas spread, faster than blades ever could. Temujin reorganized his forces, not by family or tribe, but by merit. Units of tens, hundreds, and thousands were formed. Loyalty was the new lineage. A former herder might lead a company. A former noble might serve under him. The steppe, once fragmented by bloodlines, was being rewoven by a new thread. Shared purpose. By the end of the century, the change was visible not just in stories, but in structure. The clans had become a people. Their languages still varied. Their songs still distinct. But they rode under one vision, one discipline, one dream. Temujin, once a child abandoned to the mercy of winter, now led a confederation that stretched from river valley to desert ridge. Around campfires across the plains, his name was spoken with reverence, not as a warlord, but as a unifier. And yet, the journey was not done. The stars above still whispered of a future unfulfilled. There was one more step to take, one moment that would seal his legacy. The time had come for a title, a name that would no longer belong just to the steppe, but to history. It was the spring of 1206. The air above the Mongolian steppe shimmered faintly with promise, warmed by a sun that rose slowly over a horizon of rolling green. The morning felt unusually still, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Far off, horses neighed softly, and grazing herds lifted their heads toward the sound of gathering footsteps. Thousands of warriors, men who had once ridden against one another in bitter feuds, now converged peacefully on a single place, the banks of the Onon River. This was where Temujin had played as a boy, chasing dragonflies through wildflowers, listening to the river murmur secrets only children could hear. Now, he returned not as a child, nor even as a chieftain, but as the man who had bent history into a new shape. The fragmented tribes had become one people under his hand. The moment had arrived to give this unity a name. The Kurultai, the sacred gathering of the Mongol clans, rose like a temporary city from the grass. Felt tents, their round tops flaring like mushrooms after rain, formed concentric rings around a central fire. Each yurt represented a different lineage, a different history, and yet, on this day, they all stood side by side. Campfires crackled gently, and the hum of whispered conversation rose like morning mist, carrying hope, tension, and something else, reverence. At the center, Temujin stood in silence. He did not wear a crown, for Mongol tradition favored symbols written in sky and gesture, not gold. But there was a weight to him, a stillness that silenced murmurs when he entered a space. He was no longer just a man. He had become a mirror for an entire people's dreams. The ceremony itself was modest in form, but immense in meaning. Shamans circled him slowly, chanting prayers that seemed to stretch both backward and forward in time. Their staffs rattled with bones and bells, invoking the eternal blue sky, the sky that watched over birth and death, that heard every oath and witnessed every betrayal. They painted his face with sacred ash and tied cords around his wrist, symbols of responsibility, not privilege. Then, with voices rising like thunder from the plain, the gathered Mongols declared him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The title was new, forged for this very moment. It did not come from ancestry, nor from divine right, but from earned allegiance. It was both a coronation and a contract between one man and a multitude who had chosen to follow him. As the chant echoed across the land, even the grass seemed to bow in acknowledgement. Hawks wheeled overhead. Horses stamped. Somewhere, a baby cried and was gently hushed. Life continued, but the world had changed. From that moment forward, Temujin was no longer merely a leader of tribes. He was Genghis Khan, the first of his name, the first to imagine that the steppe might not be the end of the world, but its beginning. With a new name came a new purpose. Before him lay not only pasture land, but potential. Cities, kingdoms, civilizations that had never seen a Mongol bow or heard the thunder of Mongol hooves. Yet Genghis Khan did not rush into conquest like a hungry predator. He was deliberate, like a craftsman shaping a delicate tool. First, he turned inward, refining what he had built. He reshaped Mongol society, reweaving its ancient fabric with new threads of discipline and structure. The old system, based on tribal lineage, was replaced with one built on loyalty and merit. Soldiers were grouped into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. These new military families were forged not by blood, but by battle-tested trust. A son of a shepherd might command nobles. A former enemy might rise through service. It was a revolution, not of weapons, but of thinking. He appointed leaders not for who their fathers were, but for who they had proven themselves to be. His nukers, personal companions who had stood by him since Baljuna, were given command of entire armies. Some had once been beggars or blacksmiths. Under his reign, they became generals. Imagine the reaction across the steppe. Men who had never been invited to speak at a fire circle were now leading thousand-strong battalions. Those born into power bristled, but those who had tasted hardship felt a tide rising beneath them. Once internal unity was secure, Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward. To the west lay the Western Xia Kingdom, an old dynasty nestled between the Mongol heartlands and the sprawling empires of China. Their people were settled, cultured, defended by stone fortresses and narrow mountain passes. It was a different world, yet Genghis Khan did not hesitate. He saw not walls, but puzzles to be solved. The campaign against the Western Xia was not a reckless raid, but a calculated test. His armies moved with eerie precision, guided by a blend of instinct and observation. They studied how water flowed through valleys, how clouds gathered over enemy strongholds. Mongol cavalry danced across the land, splitting into units, only to reunite at perfect moments, like birds in coordinated flight. When the Western Xia capital resisted, Genghis did something unexpected. He learned. He sought out Chinese engineers, men who understood siegecraft, towers, trebuchets, tunnels. Rather than see them as enemies, he welcomed them into his ranks, feeding them, honoring them, asking them to teach. The steppe-born warriors learned fast. The Mongols, often dismissed as simple horsemen, became masters of siege warfare almost overnight. They surrounded the capital, cut off supply lines, and waited. When the city fell, it was not just a conquest. It was proof that the Mongols were no longer a tribal army. They were an empire in motion. Success bred confidence, and confidence bred ambition. To the east lay the Jin dynasty, a powerful state cloaked behind high walls and older than the Mongols' dreams. Their envoys arrived, haughty and demanding tribute. Perhaps they expected a chieftain's submission. Genghis Khan's reply was quiet, but thunderous in meaning. The Mongols kneeled to no one, only to the eternal blue sky. It was not a rejection. It was a declaration of identity. Thus began one of the most complex campaigns of the era. The Jin were not easily frightened. Their cities were fortified, their armies experienced, but they had grown accustomed to fighting in predictable ways: siege, diplomacy, retreat. The Mongols, by contrast, were wind. They came from nowhere, struck with silence and speed, and vanished before a proper defense could be mounted. Their cavalry covered vast distances, appearing where least expected. They communicated with signals, flags, and riders who could carry messages hundreds of miles in days. Each engagement refined their skill. Each defeat taught them. Each victory expanded their understanding. By 1215, they reached Zhongdu, the mighty capital that would one day be called Beijing. The siege lasted weeks. The resistance was fierce, but so too was the Mongol resolve. They employed engineers to collapse walls, used decoys to confuse defenders, and turned defectors into guides. When Zhongdu finally fell, it was more than a victory. It was a revelation. The world's powers now saw what the Mongols had become. Not raiders, not rebels, but rulers. In that moment, on the walls of the conquered city, Genghis Khan stood silent. He looked not with arrogance, but with clarity. Before him stretched the rooftops of a civilization older than his ancestors' memories. Smoke curled from chimneys. Lanterns flickered in the dusk. Somewhere, a dog barked, oblivious to history. Perhaps in that quiet, he remembered the days of hunger, the nights staring at stars, wondering if he'd live to see 20. He had no palace then, no soldiers, no title, only fire in his chest and frost on his skin. Now, he had both, but he still stared upward, not to admire his achievement, but to remember. The sky remained vast. There were more stars to follow, more paths to walk, and history. By the 1210s, the Mongol Empire had become more than a rumor carried by merchants. It had become a rising wind, felt from the forests of Manchuria to the riverbanks of northern China. Its leader, Genghis Khan, now bore the weight of a destiny that reached far beyond the steppe. But as with all expanding forces, a moment came when that destiny collided with another power, one that would neither bend nor understand. That moment arrived in the deserts and trading cities of Central Asia. In a place called Khwarezm, the Khwarezmian Empire, sprawling across present-day Iran, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, was wealthy, proud, and secure behind its massive walls and caravanserai trade routes. Its rulers believed themselves untouched by nomadic politics, invincible within their culture of courtly etiquette and deep-rooted bureaucracy. They wore silk and debated poetry. They built libraries and palaces with turquoise domes. They looked east and saw only emptiness. What they didn't see was the silence before a storm. It began not with war, but with good faith. Genghis Khan, ever the strategist, saw the Khwarezmian Empire not as a battlefield, but as a partner. He envisioned trade, goods flowing between the steppes and the cities, Mongol horses for Persian glass, steppe wool for silk and spice. To make this dream real, he sent a caravan, laden with gifts, escorted by merchants, protected by Mongol banners of peace. But diplomacy requires more than intention. It requires mutual respect. The governor of Otrar, one of Khwarezm's key frontier cities, saw the caravan not as a gesture of alliance, but as a threat. Perhaps he suspected spies among the traders. Perhaps he feared Mongol eyes measuring his defenses. Perhaps he simply saw an opportunity for plunder. Whatever the reason, the governor seized the caravan, executed many of its members, and sent the survivors to the Khwarezmian Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, as trophies. Genghis Khan paused. He did not erupt in rage. He did not retaliate blindly. He did what he always did first. He thought. Then he sent a second envoy. 3 men, diplomats, not soldiers, bearing messages of peace, and one request: punish the governor, and peace will remain. The Shah, intoxicated with pride, responded by executing one envoy and humiliating the others. He shaved their heads, a grave insult, and returned them dishonored. This time, Genghis Khan did not pause. He gathered his generals. He spoke softly, not with anger, but with intent sharpened to a blade's edge. His voice was cold wind before a blizzard. "This," he said, "is not war. This is judgment." What followed was not a campaign. It was a transformation of war itself. He mobilized more than 100,000 cavalry, accompanied by engineers, siege equipment, and scouts. The Mongol army, divided into flexible units, fanned across the steppe like shadow and fire. They crossed deserts with no water but what they carried. They mapped the winds. They read the dunes like scripture. The assault on the Khwarezmian Empire was swift, surgical, and devastating. City after city fell. Bukhara, with its golden minarets and holy scholars, was surrounded and seized. Genghis Khan entered not as a barbarian, but as a storm in human form. He walked into the great mosque, addressed the people not with fire, but with words. "If you had not committed treachery," he said, "your city would stand." He allowed scholars to live, but soldiers, and those who resisted, they were shown what it meant to defy an empire born in hunger. From Samarkand to Merv, from Nishapur to Herat, the Mongols moved like a memory of fire, one that could not be undone. They laid siege not only to stone, but to legacy. Yet their destruction was never random. It was calculated, strategic. When cities surrendered, they were spared. When they resisted, they were made examples. At Nishapur, a beloved Mongol commander, Genghis Khan's son-in-law, was killed by a hidden assassin. The response was brutal. Genghis ordered the city razed and its population slain, not for vengeance alone, but to signal that loyalty meant life, and betrayal, extinction. And still, the Shah ran. Ala ad-Din fled from city to city, casting off advisors and honor alike. He abandoned his court, his soldiers, even his own sons. With each retreat, he left behind the crumbling shell of empire. The Mongols followed, not with fury, but with patience. They didn't need to catch him. His fear did their work. He died on an island in the Caspian Sea, alone, sick, and exiled from the world he had ruled. And the Mongols, they had reached the edge of Persia, but Genghis Khan did not stop there. Instead, he split his forces, a move no one anticipated. He sent his generals, Jabi and Subutai, on a journey westward that would become the stuff of legend. It was not just a military operation. It was a reconnaissance in depth, a probe into the very heart of the unknown. They swept across the Caucasus, defeating Georgian knights in mountain passes and crushing combined armies in the plains beyond. They studied every fortress, every river, every weakness. At the Battle of the Kalka River, they faced an alliance of Rus princes and Kipchak Turks. Though outnumbered, the Mongols feigned retreat, a tactic they had perfected to art, and drew their enemies into disarray. When the Rus forces finally collapsed, the Mongols offered their commanders a chilling mercy. They were crushed alive beneath wooden planks, suffocated, without bloodshed. It was not vengeance, it was instruction. The world would know. The Mongols did not forget, and they did not forgive treachery. But it was not all cruelty. In each new land, Genghis Khan sent envoys to study culture, collect maps, translate texts. His armies carried Persian astronomers, Chinese scribes, Muslim doctors. He respected skill, not origin. If a man could heal, he was protected. If he could build, he was honored. The Mongols brought not only death, but also ideas. They created postal routes, standardized weights, and instituted laws that protected trade caravans across thousands of miles. A merchant could ride from the Yellow River to the Black Sea under the same banner of security. Genghis Khan believed in order, not of comfort, but of clarity. One law for all, one ruler above tribes and temples alike. And beneath that sky, peace could be possible. Even amid ash and smoke, a strange kind of order was being born. By the end of this campaign, the Khwarezmian Empire was gone, its rulers dead, its cities burned, its people scattered like sand in wind. But the message remained, etched into the world's memory. The Mongol Empire was no longer a regional power. It was an entity with no horizon. It could arrive anywhere. It could remake everything. And Genghis Khan, now in his 6th decade, stood at the height of his power. He did not smile. He did not bask. He simply looked west, and then north, and then east. For even in triumph, he remembered the past, the cold nights, the betrayals, the hunger, and so he asked, what remains? What still waits in shadow? Where must the flame go next? By the 1220s, the Mongol Empire had become a vast breathing entity, spanning from the frozen rivers of Siberia to the burning deserts of Persia, from the forested edge of Korea to the mountain passes of the Caucasus. It was no longer a nomadic collection of clans. It was something new, something the world had never seen before. But for Genghis Khan, power was never the destination. It was only the means. The conquests, though dramatic, had never been the core of his dream. Now, as he stood upon the high ridges of his homeland once more, he turned inward, not to rest, but to build. And what he built was not made of stone. The Mongols had no towering palaces, no marble courts, no golden thrones. What they did have was vision and discipline. Genghis Khan reorganized the empire like a craftsman carving a tool, with precision, patience, and a deep respect for function. His vision was built on clarity, clear laws, clear loyalties, and clear consequences. He gathered his scribes, men from all corners of the empire, Uyghurs, Persians, Chinese, Arabs, and instructed them to write down laws that had once only been spoken. The result was the Yasa, a codified set of principles, flexible yet firm, binding all under the same sky. It covered theft, betrayal, military structure, taxation, and even the rules of hospitality. He outlawed the kidnapping of women between tribes. He declared religious freedom throughout his empire. He instituted punishment not based on status, but on action. Whether a noble or a herdsman, if you disobeyed the law, the punishment was the same. This shocked the aristocracy, but it inspired the common. Suddenly a merchant from Samarkand and a shepherd from the Orkhon Valley could ride under the same law, protected by the same imperial seal. Genghis Khan also created an imperial postal system, the Yam, which functioned like a living artery across the empire. Relay stations were built every 25 to 30 miles, stocked with fresh horses and food. Messengers could travel more than 200 miles in a single day, carrying intelligence, orders, and trade dispatches across continents. These roads became veins of unity, linking far-flung provinces, not just by geography, but by governance. With a flick of a messenger's hand, the Khan could command across thousands of miles. A decision made in Mongolia could affect a town in modern-day Iran before the moon completed its cycle. The empire breathed. Information was its blood. And yet, for all this order, Genghis Khan remained a man of the wind. He refused to build a permanent palace. He lived in a yurt, even as emissaries begged to construct marble halls. He preferred open skies, the flicker of firelight on felt walls, the sound of hooves and breath and quiet. He slept on earth, not linen, ate with his hands, listened more than he spoke. But now, in the winter of his life, the past came often to visit. At night, when the wind howled across the plain like a long-forgotten voice, he would sit alone and stare into the fire. His generals dined nearby. His sons quarrelled in whispered tones outside. But the Khan? He sat in silence, eyes lost in flickering flame. Perhaps he remembered Holan, his mother, fierce and strong, who had taught him resilience with roots and river fish. Perhaps he thought of Berta, his wife, taken and returned, who never wavered even as empires rose and fell. Or maybe he thought of Jamuka, his once brother, once rival, now dust among the grasses. His sons were many, but their unity was not certain. There was Yochi, his eldest, born shortly after Berta's return from capture, a shadow of uncertainty lingering around his parentage, a wound unspoken. Genghis loved him, but distantly. There was Chagatai, fiery and proud, more interested in his own glory than the harmony of brothers. There was Ogedei, the moderate, diplomatic, perhaps the only one who could hold fire in his hand without being burned. And there was Tolui, the youngest, most loyal, most like Genghis himself, a quiet strength, always listening, always present. As their father aged, the question hung heavier. Who would inherit the flame? He did not want to see his legacy split into quarrels and kingdoms. He wanted unity, not of land, but of heart. So he called a council. And after days of silence, discussion, and stargazing, he named Ogedei as his successor. Not the strongest, not the firstborn, but the most balanced. The empire, he knew, would need a weaver, not a warrior. Still, even as he passed the torch in spirit, Genghis Khan was not finished. To the south, in the shadows of the Western Shia dynasty, a challenge had been brewing. Though they had once submitted to him in name, they had grown rebellious, withholding troops, delaying tribute, ignoring orders. It was a small rebellion by imperial standards, but for Genghis Khan, rebellion was never small. He saw disobedience not as defiance, but as decay, and he had always believed in pruning rot before it spread. So, one last campaign was prepared, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. His generals advised caution. His sons offered to lead in his place, but Genghis Khan refused. His heart, after all, had been built for roads. He mounted his horse once more, his armour less bright than before, his beard more silver, but his eyes sharp as ever. As the wind tugged at his standard, he whispered a line he had once spoken to Berta. A leader must ride until he no longer can. As the army moved across the desert toward the stubborn cities of the Western Sia, the Khan rode at its centre, silent, focused, and strangely still. Each night, he walked alone beyond the fires, letting the wind wash over his weathered face. He had buried friends, enemies, even sons. He had crossed every river but one. He did not fear death, but he feared incompletion. And so, even as pain grew in his bones and old wounds ached like ancient songs, he pressed onward. For a man born in hardship, the road had always been home. One evening, near the edge of the Gobi Desert, he called for his chronicler. "Write this down," he said softly. "The greatest joy is not the conquest of cities. It is the binding of hearts beneath a single sky." Then he turned and rode into the dusk, the orange sun catching on his silhouette like fire. The last journey had begun. 6. The final campaign of Genghis Khan was not his most glorious, nor his most famous. It was quiet. The banners still waved, the hooves still thundered, the warriors still marched. But there was a hush around it, like the stillness before the end of a song. To the world, it seemed like another campaign of conquest. Yet to those closest to the Khan, there was something different in the way he moved, the way he stared long into the fire each night. The Western Shia, long defiant in subtle ways, had refused their last chance at peace. And so, the Mongol army descended upon them, with the precision of a craftsman making his final stroke. City after city fell, not with great bloodshed, but with resignation. The Khan's mind, sharper than ever, devised siege after siege with ruthless clarity. He accepted no surrender until the final capital collapsed beneath him. But even as victory approached, the weight of years caught up with him. Some say he fell from his horse while hunting wild animals near the mountains. Others say he was injured in battle, or poisoned, or slowly wasting from old wounds. The truth remains unclear, not because it was unknown, but because it was kept hidden. Genghis Khan, the man who had once been left to starve on the banks of a cold river, who had united tribes and shattered kingdoms, died in August 1227. His body was returned to Mongolia under a shroud of secrecy. No great announcement, no public mourning. His guards killed anyone who saw the funeral procession. The exact location of his grave remains a mystery to this day, buried somewhere in the sacred Khenti Mountains, beneath earth that he once trod as a barefoot child. Even in death, he returned to the soil, quietly, completely, and yet the silence did not mean the end. Before he passed, Genghis Khan gave orders for continuity. He had prepared his sons, selected his successor, and reminded his generals that the empire was not a man, but an idea. And so, even as the fires of grief burned within their hearts, his commanders continued his work. His son, Ogedai, true to his father's wishes, ascended as Great Khan. Under his leadership, the Mongol Empire surged outward like a second tide. In the years that followed, Mongol hooves thundered across Kiev, Baghdad, Vienna, and the banks of the Danube. Their flags flew over palaces and deserts, forests, and rice paddies. In less than 2 generations, the empire would become the largest contiguous land empire in human history, an entity stretching from the Sea of Japan to the forests of Poland, from the Siberian tundra to the tropical plains of Vietnam. But none of it would have happened without the boy named Temujin, the boy who trapped fish with bare hands, who learned justice from hunger, who rose not by birth, but by belief. And now, as the fire in our story dies low and the wind quiets once more over the dark steppe, I invite you to reflect with me. Let's set aside for a moment the swords, the cities, the dust of war. Let us not speak only of empire and conquest. Let's speak instead of vision. Because what Genghis Khan built was more than dominion. He built systems, laws where there was none, unity where there had been fracture, communication where there had only been rumor. He gave the scattered peoples of Asia a thread to hold on to, a single sky under which loyalty, once earned, was honored regardless of blood. Was he ruthless? Absolutely. Were his methods often unforgiving? Undeniably. But underneath the armor and strategy was something rarer than power: clarity. He knew who he was, he knew what he wanted, and he knew how to get there without waiting for permission from history. As I look back on his life, I'm struck not by the cities he destroyed, but by what he held sacred: discipline, loyalty, justice, freedom of belief. In a time when kings ruled by divine decree, he ruled by capability. And in a world torn by inheritance, he ruled by merit. He lived on horseback, died with dignity, and left behind not just a trail of victories, but a legacy that forced the world to reimagine what was possible. And now, centuries later, we still whisper his name, not with fear, but with wonder. Temujin, Genghis Khan, child of the steppe, shaper of continents, a name that still echoes through mountains, across deserts, beneath stars. And perhaps tonight, as you close your eyes, you can hear that echo too, carried by the same wind that once tugged at his coat, brushed his cheek and whispered, "Ride, always ride. Sleep well, traveller. The empire